Welcome, little listeners, to tonight's bedtime story on our magical podcast, where dreams take flight and adventures are as big as your imagination. Tonight, we'll meet a boy with a passion for plants and an old man with a forgotten garden. Get ready for a story that shows us how kindness can bloom in the most unexpected places, and how sometimes the best way to heal a heart is by tending to a garden. So, shall we begin? Listen carefully, for our story starts on a quiet street where an overgrown garden holds more secrets than anyone could guess. In a cosy little town called Sunnydale, where the streets were lined with tall, whispering trees, there lived a boy named Alfie. He was 10 years old, with messy brown hair that always seemed to have a leaf or two stuck in it. Alfie loved nothing more than getting his hands dirty in his small garden patch behind his house. Every afternoon after school, Alfie would rush home, toss his backpack on the kitchen floor, and dash outside to tend to his plants. He'd chat away to the tomatoes, encouraging them to grow big and red, and he'd sing little songs to the sunflowers, praising their bright yellow petals. Alfie's mum would often watch him from the kitchen window, smiling at her son's gentle nature. "Don't forget to water the daisies," she'd call, and Alfie would grin and give her a thumbs up, his face smudged with dirt. Just next door to Alfie's house stood a big, old Victorian building with peeling paint and overgrown hedges. It looked sad and neglected, much like its owner, old Mr. Wilbur. Little Alfie had only caught glimpses of the grumpy old man through the dusty windows. Wilbur spent most of his days sitting in an armchair, scowling at the world outside. The other children in the neighbourhood were scared of Wilbur. "He's a grump," they'd whisper. "He shouts at anyone who comes near his house." But little Alfie couldn't help feeling curious about the mysterious old man and his wild, untamed garden. One sunny Saturday, while Alfie was playing football with his friend Tommy in the front yard, the ball soared over the fence and landed with a soft thud in Wilbur's overgrown lawn. "Oh, no," Tommy groaned. "We'll never get it back now. Old Wilbur will probably pop it with his walking stick." But Alfie squared his shoulders bravely. "Don't worry, I'll go and ask for it back. It can't be that bad, can it?" With a deep breath, Alfie pushed open the rusty gate and made his way up the weed-choked path to Wilbur's front door. His knock echoed in the quiet street. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the door creaked open, and there stood Wilbur, his bushy eyebrows furrowed in a fierce scowl. "What do you want?" he barked, his voice rough like sandpaper. Little Alfie gulped but stood his ground. Hello, Mr. Wilbur. I'm Alfie from next door. Our football landed in your garden. May we please have it back?" Wilbur's scowl deepened. "You kids and your noise. Can't an old man get any peace?" He disappeared for a moment, then returned with the ball, tossing it roughly at Alfie. "Now clear off and don't come back." The door slammed shut, leaving Alfie standing there, clutching the ball and feeling a bit shaken. As he turned to leave, something caught his eye. Through a gap in the overgrown bushes, he spotted a flash of colour, a single, beautiful rose struggling to bloom amidst the weeds. Over the next few days, Alfie couldn't stop thinking about that rose and the sad, overgrown garden. He remembered how his gran had always said, "A garden is good for the soul." It teaches us patience and brings joy to everyone who sees it. So, one afternoon, Alfie made a decision. He gathered up his gardening gloves and a small trowel and marched over to Wilbur's house. This time, when he knocked on the door, he was ready for the grumpy response. "You again," Wilbur growled. "I told you to stay away." But Alfie stood firm. "Mr. Wilbur, sir, I noticed your garden needs some care." I love gardening, and I'd be happy to help you tidy it up a bit. No charge, of course." Wilbur's eyes narrowed suspiciously. "And why would you want to do that? What's in it for you?" Little Alfie shrugged, his eyes bright with enthusiasm. "I just love gardens, sir. It seems a shame to let such a big one go to waste. Plus," he added with a cheeky grin, "my mum says I have too much energy. This would be a great way to use it up." For a moment, Wilbur looked like he might slam the door again. But then something flickered in his eyes, a mix of surprise and perhaps a tiny spark of interest. "Do what you want. Just don't make a racket or expect me to help," he grunted. And with that, he shuffled back inside, leaving the door slightly ajar. Little Alfie could hardly believe his luck. He set to work right away, starting with the overgrown flower beds near the house. As he worked, he chattered away, mostly to himself but loud enough for Wilbur to hear through the open window. "Oh, look at these lovely rose bushes. They just need a bit of pruning, that's all. And over here, I think these might be daffodil bulbs. They'll come up lovely in the spring if we give them a chance." Days passed, and slowly but surely, the garden began to transform. Alfie came by every afternoon, working tirelessly despite the late summer heat. At first, Wilbur pretended to ignore him, but Alfie noticed the old man watching from the window more and more often. One particularly hot day, as Alfie was struggling with a stubborn root, he heard a gruff voice behind him. "You're doing it all wrong, boy." Little Alfie turned to see Wilbur standing in the doorway, leaning on a walking stick. The old man hobbled over, grumbling all the way. "Here, let me show you. You need to get right under it like this." With surprising strength, Wilbur demonstrated the proper technique. From that day on, a strange sort of partnership formed between the unlikely pair. Wilbur would sit in a lawn chair, calling out instructions and sharing his vast gardening knowledge, while little Alfie eagerly soaked it all in, asking questions and working with renewed energy. As the weeks went by, Alfie noticed a change in Wilbur. The permanent scowl began to soften, and sometimes Alfie even caught a hint of a smile on the old man's face. One afternoon, as little Alfie was carefully planting some new flower bulbs, Wilbur cleared his throat. "You know, boy," he said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "My Evelyn, she loved roses. We used to grow them together, right over there." Alfie looked up, surprised. It was the first time Wilbur had mentioned anyone from his past. "Who's Evelyn, Mr. Wilbur?" Wilbur's eyes grew distant, filled with a mix of sadness and fond memories. "My wife. She passed away 5 years ago. After that, I just couldn't bear to look at the garden anymore. It reminded me too much of her." Little Alfie felt a lump in his throat. Suddenly, he understood why Wilbur had been so grumpy, why the garden had been left to grow wild. "I'm sorry, Mr. Wilbur," he said softly. "It must have been very hard for you." Wilbur nodded, then shook himself as if coming out of a dream. "Yes, well, perhaps it's time to make the garden beautiful again. Evelyn would have liked that." From that day on, Wilbur became more involved in the gardening. He started to come outside more often, at first just to sit and watch, but soon he was offering to help with small tasks. Little Alfie noticed that the more time Wilbur spent in the garden, the more his mood seemed to lift. As autumn approached, the garden had been completely transformed. Neat flower beds bursted with colour. The lawn was trim and green, and a small vegetable patch promised a good harvest. But the crowning glory was the rose bush that Alfie and Wilbur had planted together. One crisp Saturday morning, Alfie arrived to find Wilbur already outside, a mug of tea in his hand and a content smile on his face. "Good morning, Mr. Wilbur," Alfie called cheerfully. "The garden's looking brilliant, isn't it?" Wilbur nodded, his eyes twinkling. "That it is, my boy. That it is. And it's all thanks to you." Little Alfie blushed, shuffling his feet. "Oh, I didn't do much. You're the one who knew what to do with everything." Wilbur chuckled, a sound that Alfie realized he'd never heard before. "Nonsense. This garden would still be a jungle if it weren't for your stubbornness. You know, Alfie, you've taught this old man a valuable lesson." "I have?" Alfie asked, surprised. "Indeed," Wilbur said, looking out over the garden. "You've shown me that it's never too late to start over, to find joy again. And you've reminded me that sometimes the best way to honour the memory of those we've lost is to keep doing the things they loved." Little Alfie felt a warm glow in his chest. He hadn't just helped bring a garden back to life. He'd helped bring back a little bit of life to Wilbur too. As they stood there, admiring their handiwork, Alfie's mum called from next door. "Alfie dear, I've made some scones. Why don't you invite Mr. Wilbur over for tea?" Wilbur looked at Alfie, raising an eyebrow. "What do you say, boy? Shall we take a break and have some of those scones?" Alfie grinned from ear to ear. "That sounds brilliant, Mr. Wilbur." And so the unlikely pair made their way next door, leaving behind a beautiful garden that stood as a testament to the power of kindness, the strength of new friendships, and the joy that can bloom when different generations come together. As they walked, Wilbur put a hand on Alfie's shoulder. "You know, my boy," he said softly, "I think Evelyn would have liked you very much." Little Alfie beamed up at him. "And I think I would have liked her too, Mr. Wilbur. I'm glad I got to know you and help with your garden." "So am I, Alfie," Wilbur replied with a warm smile. "So am I." And with that, they stepped into Alfie's house, ready to enjoy scones and tea. And there you have it, dear listeners. A tale of how a little boy's love for gardening helped an old man rediscover joy, and how an overgrown garden became a place of new beginnings. Little Alfie and Wilbur remind us that friendship can sprout in the most unlikely soil, and that it's never too late to start fresh. If you enjoyed tonight's tale, don't forget to share the story with your friends and subscribe to our magical podcast. As the story ends and the children close their eyes, they enter a world where anything is possible, and then they dreamed.